This is episode 82 of the Why Not Me podcast, books I've read in 2022. I'm your host, Danita Bremer. I'm a wife, mom, member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and a life coach. And in this podcast, we talk about how to overcome our inner obstacles to endure this life well. If you haven't heard about the podcast giveaway yet, I announced it in last week's episode. I'm giving away 2 pair of second generation Apple AirPods to a lucky listener and the friend that referred them to the podcast. So, in order to qualify for the prize, you have to do 4.5 things. 1, listen to an episode. So, if you're here, you're halfway done. 2, leave a 5-star rating. 3, leave a review, and a half with at least one takeaway from the podcast. And 4, fill out a Google form just so that if you win, I know how to contact you because I don't have any information from Apple. All I have is the handle that you use when you're leaving the review. Feel free to share with everybody, with your real life friends, with your social media friends, and you'll increase your odds of winning. So I hope you win. Good luck. And before we get started, we have some people working on our house. We're getting our house painted next week. And today we're getting some trim around some windows replaced. So there might be some banging. I hope they don't come right to this window that's 2 feet away from me, but if they do, they do. And that's my real life. So I'm working on bringing my real life, my real self to everything that I do and not apologizing. So there you have it. Today, I thought it would be fun to talk about the books that I've read this year. And usually I wouldn't do kind of an overview like this, but this morning I received a Secret Post newsletter from Laura Tremaine, somebody that I follow, and I follow very few people. And she sends these emails out every once in a while, not regularly, but I got one this morning and it was all the books that she's read this year. And I didn't really think about it this morning when I saw it, but when I sat down to figure out what am I going to say today for the podcast, nothing was resonating. And you guys, I have like 60 podcast ideas. I use Notion and I've got this page in Notion where I keep track of all my podcast ideas. And I was looking through that. I was thinking and just nothing was speaking to me. And I have a couple ideas in there about books. And I thought, I went over to the page I have with all the books that I've read this year. And I thought, I think I just want to talk about all of these because they're all really good. And I think it also kind of, well, first of all, it'll help me cement some of the things I've learned from these books into my mind. And I hope to share with you some really good ideas and books. And maybe you'll go out and read some of these, and that will help you. And also you get to know a person pretty well by the books they read. So there you have it. I have read 20 books so far in 2022 from January 1st through today is July 8th. I'm in the middle of a book, so that's number 21. And that's kind of a lot for me. I have read like 50 books in a year, which was like the most ever. But this year I've been very moseying. I've been reading shorter books. But I did that social media. Well, I'm still in the middle. Well, not in the middle. I'm toward the end of my social media fast. And in the middle of that social media fast, or at the beginning, I did 40 days of no inputs except for God's word. So scripture, or I allowed like 2 podcasts that were really based on scripture and Christ and all of those things. But I cut out all other podcasts, all books, and it made me really itchy actually, but it was a good exercise for me to just like quiet my life. And so considering that I didn't read anything from the middle of April until the end of May, that's a whole month and a half. That's quite a few books for me. That's quite a high rate. And I find it really interesting since that 40 days of no reading, I think I read 8 books in June. That's 2 a week. That's extremely a lot for me in 1 month. So it was a good contrast for me to go without reading for a while and to be like, oh, now I can read. And I just started devouring everything in sight, basically. So I'm going to go through these books loosely from in the order that I read them from January to July. And I'm going to mention every book that I read, but the ones that didn't land as well with me, I'm just going to be super brief with those ones. I want to spend a little more time with the ones that I really, really enjoyed and made me think. And I keep track of the name of the book, the author. I think most of these I have the author, when I read, or it's really when I finished the book, and then I give it like a star rating out of 5 stars. And then for the purposes of this podcast, I wrote down whether I read it on Kindle or I listened to it or had the physical book, or if I own it or I got it from the library or rented it somewhere. So let's get going because this podcast has the potential to be super long. Yeah. So the first book I finished in 2022 was The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. I'm going to say Coelho. Paulo Coelho. It is a book that I had heard about quite a few times. That I don't think I've ever heard anybody say something negative about this book. Well, maybe my teenager. I think my teenager read it in school and she was like, She's like, it's good, but it's not like great, right? But I really enjoyed it. It is a fiction book, but it's about kind of a journey of self-discovery and following your desires and your passions. I thought I would just read the inside flap because it's really short. Paulo Coelho's enchanting novel has inspired a devoted following around the world. I'm not exactly sure when this book was published. Let me look it up really quickly. But it's an older book. Let's see, 1994? 1994 is the earliest edition, I think. Oh, nope, 1988 is the earliest edition. So he has a devoted following around the world. This story, dazzling in its powerful simplicity and soul-stirring wisdom, is about an Andalusian shepherd boy named Santiago who travels from his homeland in Spain to the Egyptian desert in search of a treasure buried near the pyramids. Along the way, he meets a gypsy woman, a man who calls himself king, and an alchemist, all of whom point Santiago in the direction of his quest. No one knows what the treasure is or if Santiago will be able to surmount the obstacles in his path. But what starts out as a journey to find worldly goods turns into a discovery of the treasure found within. Lush, evocative, and deeply humane, the story of Santiago is an eternal testament to the transforming power of our dreams and the importance of listening to our hearts. So I think it's very fitting that this was the first book I read of the year because that probably sums up my own journey this year for sure, but maybe even in the last year. This idea of surmounting obstacles, journeying, discovery, starting out as a quest for worldly goods and turning into, transforming and listening to our dreams and our hearts. That is like the epitome of the theme that I noticed as I was listing out these books and what I learned from them. So that's book number 1. Numbers 2, 3, and 4 are 3 books in a series. And they're all very short. They're actually children's books. I wouldn't say they're appropriate for very young children, but I read them out loud to my 8 or 9-year-old several years ago. And so they're by the author Jerry Massey, and they're called The Bridge, The Crown, and Two Collars. And they're very fast, very short books. If you're on YouTube, you can see what I'm holding up here. But they're basically 3 stories about a wise woman type of Christ. It's kind of a good versus evil. There are themes about playing your part, sacrifice, healing, trust. And I just love these stories. I came across them when I was homeschooling, and I found them through some program that I had decided to use for school for like our reading and literature. And they came with, at the time, they used to have CDs that you could listen. And I always looked for that so that if I didn't have time, because at this time, when my oldest was in, I think she was third grade, I had two little kids too. And so I always tried to set things up so that she could be on her own if I needed her to be, at least part of the time. And we had a really good experience reading these books and discussing them. And so earlier this year, I thought, I kind of want to find those and read them again. And I don't know why I was thinking about them and the stories, and I found them and I read them. And I just love those books. And, all of those themes, again, things that that are resonating with me. Let's put it that way. Okay. The fifth book I read is called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. I do own it. I bought this book. I think I was at the Amazon store in the mall and I saw it and it was on sale and I was like, I want to get that. And so I bought this, and to be honest, I rated it a 4 out of 5. I thought it was really good. It was really informative, but it was kind of a big picture, zoomed out psychology of money, like on the cultural level, although it does talk about, personal stories as well. The back of the book says, award-winning author Morgan Housel shares 19 short stories exploring the strange ways people think about money and teaches you how to make better sense of one of life's most important topics. So he talks about investing and finance and kind of like the economy and different drivers of the economy. He uses some research. So it's not just personal stories, it's research and things like that, but kind of mixed in with these personal stories. And I've been really, kind of like I said in The Alchemist, what starts out as a quest for kind of worldly goods turns into more of a self-discovery type thing. So that's kind of where I started too, was like, I'm always focused on, business and how do I make a successful business and all of that. And what I'm finding is that it really isn't about the money, although my thoughts and everything that come up around money really shine a light on my own self and how I think and, just different things about me. So that's fun. Number 6 book is called As a Man Thinketh by James Allen. It's an old book. I think it was written in the 1800s. It's a little teeny tiny book and it's very poetic, actually. It's like something you could just keep in your pocket and you could just flip open anywhere and read. Indigence and indulgence are the two extremes of wretchedness. They are both equally unnatural and the result of mental disorder. So it's kind of got this antiquated prose to it, but it is right up my alley with talking about mindset. There's a little poem, a very short little poem at the beginning that kind of is a good summary. It says, mind is the master power that molds and makes, and man is mind, and evermore he takes the tool of thought, and shaping what he wills brings forth 1,000 joys, 1,000 ills. He thinks in secret, and it comes to pass. Environment is but his looking glass. So it's this idea that what we think is what we create, and we can look around and look at our environment, look at the things we've created, and can see what we've been thinking. So it is a book that I saw on the shelf at Goodwill. And I just thought, I've heard of that book. I'm going to pick it up and read it. And so at some point I thought, I've got all these books on my shelf that I haven't read yet. I should read some of them. And so slowly I'm working my way through them. Number 7, I'm going to skip over. It's called The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. It is a book I've heard a lot about. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's a sweeping novel spanning a couple generations. It's about a family, pastor dad, and they decide to go to Africa, I think in the late 60s or 60s sometime. And it's just kind of an account of their life and what happens to them as they move their Southern American family to Africa. And it didn't quite land with me. There were parts about it that I enjoyed, but it is fiction. And so I don't know if I'm just not feeling the fiction as much this year. I don't know. Number 8 that I read that I did enjoy is a book called Whole Brain Living by Jill Bolte Taylor. This was recommended to me by a trusted friend, and I thought it was fascinating. This author, she had a stroke and she's a neuroscientist. So she has an earlier book called My Stroke of Insight that I have not read. And she basically outlines what happened to her when she had the stroke, and she could kind of like feel her certain functions of her brain shutting down or noticing that. And this is the follow-up of how, like, what she's learned over time from that experience of the stroke. She does have a TEDx talk that's super popular. But in this book, Whole Brain Living, she talks about, she calls them 4 characters in our brains and how to relate to them and get to know them and kind of use them to our advantage. I will say that the neuroscience was super fascinating. The story of this neuroscientist who then has a stroke and part of her brain shuts down, and how she like can understand and know what's going on in her brain. That part was really fascinating to me. But something about this book fell a little bit short for me. Like she was trying to teach me how to use these 4 characters, but I just couldn't quite grasp it. I don't know, maybe it was just the timing or whatever for me. Number 9 is Waking the Tiger. I don't actually have that in front of me because it's upstairs next to my bed. Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine. It is a book that I picked up quite a while ago, started reading it, put it down, picked it up again, read some more, put it down. And then earlier this year in March and April, I read more. And then I got interrupted by my little pause. And then I finished it in June. I do rate it a 5 out of 5. I own a copy. It's about trauma and how to heal trauma based off some ideas of like animal biology. It's super interesting. His ideas and theories have held up over the test of time. He's been in the trauma sphere for a long time. He does have some exercises in that book that you can kind of journal and write out and actually experience some things. So if you have any history of trauma, it might be something interesting to pick up for you. It's kind of like a textbook. It's pretty heavy. It's pretty thick. You kind of have to read it slowly to understand it. But I've been deep diving into trauma lately. So I enjoyed it. And I think it's something that I will circle back around to eventually and read again. Number 10 is a book called Think Again by Adam Grant. And this book is so good. It's so necessary and needed in today's world. It's basically, I don't own it. I got it from the library. So I went on to Amazon to kind of get a little synopsis to refresh my mind. What I basically got from this book was the value of not knowing, and how do we approach something we think we know, or do we want to revise what we think, and how valuable that is. And there was one line in the Amazon description that I just thought, oh my gosh, that is so good. It is this: if knowledge is power, knowing what we don't know is wisdom. Oh, I thought that was so good and so encapsulating of this whole book. It's just all about knowing what we don't know and how do we approach that. something I thought was really interesting was because he's an organizational psychologist. So there's tons and tons of research in this book. And he talked about a study that was done, and the people who were most staunchly committed to their point of view, one of them ended up being a serial killer. And I just was like, whoa, that's crazy, right? So you'll have to read that. But it's just this idea that we need to, in order to be the most wise and really to be like good citizens in the world, because he talks a lot about how we're um, being divided and polarized in our politics and things like that. If we want to really be wise people, we want to revisit and revise how we think about things regularly. I thought it was such a fascinating book. I probably will be buying it because it's so good. It's something that really everyone should read, honestly. Everyone that's interested in um, becoming better and improving the world, being a good citizen, all of that. The concepts in that book are so perfect and just necessary to know and understand. Okay, number 11 is a book called Personality Isn't Permanent by Dr. Benjamin Hardy. I listened to this book. I had heard about it. It had been recommended to me a while back, and I don't remember how it came back onto my radar. I think several months ago, maybe even at the beginning of the year, I put a bunch of books on hold at my library, and some of them I put both the physical copy and the audio version to see like which one would come up first. And this one came up audio. I do not listen to many books. I just generally find that I have a hard time remembering what I'm listening to. Like as I'm listening to it, I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's good. That's so good. I tend to want to highlight and like really put my hands on the book. And that helps me remember concepts from the books. But this one, for whatever reason, came up. I listened to it. It really confronted me about my thoughts about personality. I'm a big personality junkie. Because he says that basically those personality tests, Myers-Briggs, things like that, are just a bunch of fake, like they're not valid at all, is what he says. So I don't know if I totally agree with that, because in my experience, my anecdotal experience, they tend to ring true to me. And I've read a lot of different profiles that I've read, personality profiles that I'm like, nope, that's not me. Nope, that's not me, because it doesn't resonate. And then some that do, right? The ones that it says like, this is more you, always resonate. So I don't know. But in the end, I agree with his premise that no matter how we've been identifying ourselves, no matter how we've been thinking about ourselves, if you've taken some of these personality tests, you can always change. And that's basically what he's saying, is that your personality isn't permanent. It can change if you want it to. It was very interesting, and I really like his writing style. I read a second of his books, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Number 12 was a book called Codependent No More by Melody Beattie. I read it on Kindle. I only gave it a 3 out of 5 because it felt a little bit dated. It is an older book. It's from, I think it was written in the mid 80s. It was kind of revolutionary at the time it was written. I heard about it from the coach I worked with, working through my own trauma. So, codependence is the idea of losing oneself in the name of helping another person, or this idea that, like, I can only feel good when my husband feels good or when my kids feel good. Like, your well-being is tied to somebody else's actions or feelings, that kind of thing. That's what we call codependence, is like you are dependent on them. And then oftentimes they are dependent in you. This book really focuses on codependence in alcoholism, in relationships where there's an alcoholic, or maybe both people are alcoholic, and how to get out of that. And it's a really great book. It just felt like it was dated and there wasn't anything super new that I didn't really know. And so I think that's why I rated it a little bit lower. I do think it's valuable to understand the concept of codependence and how to separate who we are and how we feel and how we operate from our key relationships in our life. Okay, number 13 is a book called No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. And the subtitle is Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with the Internal Family Systems Model. So, Richard Schwartz is a psychotherapist, and he created his own model that he uses to help his clients overcome trauma and heal. I find this concept highly compelling. The idea is that within each of us, there are these different parts, and it's a system, right? It's a system of parts, just like a family is a system. So he calls this our internal family system. So he has people, and he explains all of this in the book, kind of go inside, turn inward, and get to know the different parts of them. And the book is has lots of exercises of like, try this, try this. He tries to walk you through as much as he can in a book. He gives a lot of case studies so that you can get a feel for, what might this look like. But the idea is that when we get to know these different parts of us and we speak to them and we start to lead them, we heal. When we get all the parts of us all on the same side, like one big team, we heal. Now, what happens when we're young children, these parts are created, they come out in order to protect us, or, just to cope with the world. And sometimes the parts are against each other, right? If you're listening to my podcast, you resonate with this idea of like being at war with yourself and having different parts of you that one part wants this and one part wants that, right? We even sometimes use the terminology, there's a part of me that thinks this, there's a part of me that realizes that, right? So we naturally understand ourselves through this lens of parts. So I find it really compelling. I have done a free session with a practitioner that is trained in this internal family systems model, and it was super powerful. So I wanted to read the book. I will say I gave it a 4 out of 5. It's just hard to encapsulate some of these things that you do when you're face to face in a book. And I think that's why I didn't give it a 5 out of 5. Okay, number 14 is a little bit more lighthearted. It's a book by a woman. Her name is Terry Trespicio. And Miss Trespicio, the book is called Unfollow Your Passion, How to Create a Life That Matters to You. And it's kind of interesting how I found this book. I was coaching a client and we were talking about passion and like what our purpose is. And she felt like she didn't know what her purpose was and what she was passionate about. She was passionate about so many things. And so we had that session. And then later that day, or not very long after that session, that same day, I was researching something, probably for a podcast, and I came across a YouTube video called Unfollow Your Passion. And that's what the book is called, Unfollow Your Passion. And so I was like, oh, we were just talking about passion and purpose and all of this. And so I just had to click on the video and watch it. So I watched it, and Miss Trespicio is very, very good speaker, very engaging storyteller. And she debunks the myth of passion and its so-called important role in our lives, right? There's kind of this big idea out there in the ethos that, we have to figure out what we're passionate about and we have to do that thing. And that's how to be happy and all of this. So I thought it was really interesting that she was saying like, passion is a hoax. Don't follow your passion. That's not how it actually works. And I went to her website and I just was like interested in her and what's her background. And she used to work for, I can't remember now. um, but she has like a whole like coaching practice that she does now to help business people with their copy and like really dialing in what you do and how you do it and why it's impactful and all of that. And she's a bit irreverent, but she's a great storyteller. I do recommend the TEDx talk. I'll link to it here. And what I really enjoyed about the book, because I listened to the book, is that she has lots of journaling prompts that I thought were really, really thought provoking. And because I was listening to it, I didn't stop to do all the journaling. So I bought the book so that I can go back through it and really journal some of these prompts. They were fresh, new prompts that I hadn't heard before. So I enjoyed that book. I gave it a 4 out of 5. Um, yeah, I think it kind of fits in sort of the self-help genre, which sometimes can get a little old, but I liked listening to her voice, listening to her stories. Um, if you've listened any length of time, you know that I like to weave in stories with, concepts that I teach and all of that. So she did a good job of that. Number 15 is a book called Bittersweet. I do not own it. I got this one from the library, but I read it in its physical form. The subtitle is How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole, and it's by the author Susan Cain. If you're familiar with her at all, she wrote the book Quiet, and she made a case for why introverts are so needed. So I had already read that book Quiet a few years ago. I was a little bit familiar with her. And in my line of work, I deal with lots of clients who have sorrow and grief and just this sort of type of emotion that they tend to stay in is this longing and the sorrow. And so that's why it piqued my curiosity. I was like, bittersweet. It was also like a book that was highly anticipated. She uses a lot of psychological research and other research as well. And she combines that with her own storytelling. So it's kind of like a memoir meets self-help kind of book, which I really love. It talks a lot about emotional awareness and resilience. And she makes a case for the power of sadness and bringing your entire humanness to the table. I found it fascinating how she started out kind of coming to this book, which was, why am I so attracted to sad music? Which I know a lot of people who love listening to that sad music that like makes you want to cry, that kind of thing. And those kinds of questions always interest me. And it took her on this whole journey of discovering, this bittersweetness, this not just sadness, but something that's both sad and good. And anyway, I thought it was really interesting. I would love to buy a copy and have it in my personal library because I think it's something that is actually really relevant to all of us. We all have sadness and grief in some way in our lives. And we tend to think that being sad or being in grief is a bad thing. But really, what she was saying is it's not a bad thing. It makes us human and we can use it to our advantage. Number 16 is Brene Brown's latest book, Atlas of the Heart. I had started this book before I went on my social media fast and did no reading. And in true Brene Brown fashion, it's a book about resilience and emotional awareness. It's like a dictionary for emotions. It's fabulous. It's good. I could talk about it forever. Actually, my book club is reading it this month. It's like a reference book for someone who wants to be emotionally aware and resilient. I keep coming back to this idea of resilience because the more aware we are of our emotions and what those emotions are telling us, which is basically what Brene Brown has done, is she's taken several emotions Not all of them by any means, but probably some of the most prevalent emotions that people tend to struggle with. She also talks about some of the positive emotions too. And she basically has boiled them down to, when I feel this way, what does it mean? What sentence goes along with that emotion? What in our culture does it tend to mean? And I think it's so brilliant. Like, we need this. We need this as a people right now. So I really enjoyed it. It's pretty thick though, so I just read a little bit at a time. So it took me a little while to read, but it's so good. I personally don't love the politics that she brings in, but that's sort of her area of expertise is, how do we be more courageous? How do we be more connected in our communities and in, how do we come together? So I can look through that part, but if you don't like that part of Brené Brown, then she does have a bit of that in this book as well. Um, yes, it's probably something I'll come back to and do another podcast episode on, just her book, because so many amazing things in that book, just the way she defines the emotions. I rated it a 5 out of 5. Number 17 is a book called Plain Big by Tara Moore. I listened to this one as well. And really, after I listened to it, I realized that this is like one of the earliest kind of life coaching books. It's not a new book, it's old. Let me see if I can find where. Copyright 2014. So, I mean, it's not terribly old, but it's a few years old. And this was another one that was recommended that I'd kind of heard in my circles of coaches, and keeps coming up from time to time. And usually when that happens, I write it down and go, okay, you need to read this book. So most, if not all of the concepts were not new to me, but I really, really liked how, like, just her voice and how she explained things. And this was another one that I went out and bought after I listened to it, because she has so many journaling questions. Um, she does also have her own program that walks people through all the concepts in this book. But I think if you wanted to, you could buy the book and walk yourself through them, and you wouldn't need to buy her program. Very clear, very practical. The subtitle is Practical Wisdom for Women Who Want to Speak Up, Create, and Lead, which is me. So it really resonated with me. I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 5 out of 5. So I listened to it and then I went out and bought it, which doesn't happen too much. I'm a pretty big library girl. Number 18 is the second one by Benjamin Hardy, called Be Your Future Self Now. And it's exactly what the title says. The title is very clear and very descriptive. He's the one that wrote Personality Isn't Permanent. And a big part of that book was this idea of living into your future self and deciding and crafting your future self on your own consciously, and then being that person. So this is kind of the follow-up book, Be Your Future Self Now. I read it on Kindle. I think in one of my communities, somebody said, if you like Benjamin Hardy, his newest book, Be Your Future Self Now, is on Kindle for $2. So I was like, oh, well, I just read one of his books. I might be interested in that. And I actually have also been doing a lot of future self work with myself this year. And so it just lined up with where I was. Super practical advice in this book. I will probably buy this one so that he has some exercises in there as well, so that I can revisit those exercises. I didn't think anything he said in the book was super new to me as a life coach. And I'm constantly like reading and keeping up to date as much as I can on concepts that can help people, that can help me, that can help my clients. So it wasn't new, but it was really, like, I think it's worth it to buy this book, to have all of these ideas of future self in one place where you can kind of access them together. Number 19 is a book that I rated 3 out of 5. It's called $100 Million Offers, and the author is Alex Hermosi. This is a book that went around my coaching community quite a few months ago. It's really more targeted to people who are making way more money than I am. But the main idea is how to craft a compelling offer. If you're selling something, how to describe it in a way that people feel stupid saying no to it. It's kind of, I would put it in the bro marketing genre, but there were some nuggets in there that I pulled out that I really appreciated about the psychology of pricing and just how you craft your offer is not about the price necessarily. But the price, there's like a psychology around that. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that one because most of you probably don't have a business the way I do. But if you do, um, it could be a practical book if it resonates with you. I kind of skimmed it, and there are definitely some good things in there. Okay, number 20, which is the last book I finished this year, is so good, you guys. Like, please go out and pick up this book. It is called Everything is Spiritual, and the author is Rob Bell. I liked this book so much that I rated it a 6 out of 5. It's a book that has been on my radar for a while. I've heard it recommended by several people that I follow and admire. But I didn't really quite know what it was about. And I'm not quite sure how it came back on my radar. Maybe it was one of those ones that I had put on hold at the library and then it came up and I listened to it. And I was a little hesitant. I was like, listening to another book. Like, I just don't love listening to books, but it was the perfect book to listen to. It's very poetic. He reads it himself and his voice is so good. And it doesn't even feel like he's reading you a book. It feels like he's just talking to you. It was so good. I don't quite know how to tell you about this book. So the title is Everything is Spiritual, Who We Are and What We're Doing Here. Still kind of cryptic, right? So I have to read to you the inside flap. It's a little bit long. It's not too long, but longer than the other flap I read. And I just have to say that Rob Bell put words to things I've been sensing and feeling for a long time that I didn't even know, because I hadn't really, I guess because I'm a speaker, not a writer, I hadn't solidified these thoughts yet. It resonated with me like no other book has, maybe ever, or at least for a very, very, very long time. So here's the inside flap. He says, I've had a sense since I was young that there's more going on here, that the world is not a cold, dead place, that it's alive in some compelling and mysterious way. This book is about that sense. I've tried to listen to it and follow it and trust it. It's been devastating at times, intoxicating at others, heartbreaking and maddening and euphoric. How do you make sense of this experience we're having here on this ball of rock hurtling through space at 67,000 miles an hour? There are big questions. Everything is made of particles and atoms, and the universe has been expanding for 13 billion years. And then there are those other questions about the people and places and events that have shaped us. However massive and cosmic it all is, it's also really, really personal and spiritual. That's the word for it. That's the sense I've been following for a while now. This awareness that there's something bigger happening in the depth and complexity and struggle of life, something that connects us all, reminding us that it all matters and it's all headed somewhere. Part memoir, part confession, part extended riff on the endlessly evolving nature of reality. Everything is Spiritual is an invitation to see what you've been a part of this whole time. So, still feels kind of cryptic to me, even reading the flap, but it's this combination of like scientific ideas and spiritual ideas and like tying them all together along with like identity and purpose. Rob Bell used to be a pastor. He no longer pastors, but he started his own church and it became like a mega church. because people were so attracted to him and the way he thought about things. He talks about how he stood in classrooms where the lead pastor was telling the teenagers in the church, like, you need to follow the commandments or you're going to go to hell and it's going to be brimstone and fire, and how it made him so angry because that's not how he thinks of the world. He thinks of God as like loving, and yes, God wants us to do certain things, but it's not about the brimstone and the fire and all of that, right? It's about God loves us and we're connected to him and he wants to be closer to us and he wants us to be closer to everyone else. And I can't say anymore. Just read it. I loved it so much that I listened to it. And then immediately at the end of that first listen, I restarted it again and started listening again. I'm currently in the middle of my third time listening. That's why I gave it a 6 out of 5. If you're like me and you kind of like to talk about these big ideas and big questions, and you like things to be based in science, or at least it's interesting to you to hear the science half of things, but you also love the spirituality and the God and the metaphors and all of that, I'm just like, this is the book for you. I read it twice and then I bought it because I want to read it again and carefully mark it. And it's just written. I mean, I couldn't tell when I read it or when I listened to it that the way it's written is sometimes in like poem form. So I'm kind of showing this on the video for YouTubers, but kind of how he wrote it is in poem form. So it's just very poetic and yeah. I just love it so much. So there's that. And I will say one last thing about that book. I've been listening to a podcast by a gentleman, an LDS gentleman named Jared Helverson, and he does these deep dives into the scriptures. And one of the themes that I've been noticing, I've been listening to his episodes that start with the Old Testament, is this idea that God is very poetic, that sometimes words don't do justice to the concepts, the ideas that God wants us to understand. And so much of the Old Testament is very poetic, right? It's not literal, it's figurative. And I think that's one of the reasons why this book resonated so much to me, is because I've been like priming my mind and my heart for these metaphoric kind of thoughts and ideas. And so it just really, really resonated with me. Yeah, those are the books. The themes I noticed as I was writing this out, I was like, oh, this is so fascinating. I'm clearly on this personal, journey of self-discovery. And here are some of the themes I noticed. The theme of callings in our life, like purpose and passion, identity, God, psychology, mindset, trauma, neuroscience, emotions, confidence, money. And then this theme of going outside my normal community to understand who I am and what I believe. The book I'm currently reading is The Next Right Thing by Emily P. Freeman. She's not LDS, but her books, and she has a podcast as well called The Next Right Thing, very Christian based. And I love it. I love her voice, but she's not of my faith. And the little nuances, the things that she mentions that are different, help me to understand what I believe. So I thought that was an interesting theme that came out of this. I would love to hear your questions, your thoughts. Did you get to know me better by hearing what I've read this year? Do you have questions, follow-up questions about any of these books? I will put all of the books, links to all of the books in the show notes. So this might be a good one to click over to the show notes for. And yeah, I would just love to know what you think, if this is the kind of episode you'd like more of. Should I do this a couple times a year? I would love to hear if that's something you're interested in. Yeah, that's enough for now. And so are you. Okay, don't forget to enter the podcast giveaway. Rate, review, and tell your friends to do that too. And if you've heard some themes in this episode that you think will help you to better understand, go to danitabremmer.com, schedule a free session with me. Let's chat about it. Until next time, go be you and follow the Spirit.